Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh the facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and pony owner. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing easy keepers on multiple acres of pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and like all good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We talk about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
With that, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the following episode.
When it comes to feeding myths, the one feed that probably has more myths associated than any other is alfalfa. Whether it's concerns about making horses hot, causing kidney damage, joint disorders in young horses, the list of myths is lengthy. And while these myths are shared by the keyboard warriors and barn experts with great confidence, they often don't have many facts to actually back up their claims. So we thought we'd talk about alfalfa today, where these myths came from, and whether they're actually true.
Let's start super basic. Most of our listeners will know that alfalfa is a type of forage, but it's different than other forages, such as grasses and grass hays that horses more typically eat.
Yeah, that's true. Alfalfa isn't a grass, it's a legume. And that alone explains a lot of the differences that people notice and the things that we'll talk about today. But legumes evolved to fix nitrogen in the soil. They actually have these like little lumps on their roots that kind of fix the nitrogen in the soil. And as a result, they have a higher protein content than grass hays do. And they also have a slightly different mineral profile. So legumes such as alfalfa tend to have higher calcium levels than grasses would. And this is true of other legumes too. Like there's like clover, for example, that's a legume, and that would be similar. But so alfalfa kind of falls under this sort of group of plants known as legumes.
When talking about different types of hays, horse owners will say alfalfa is rich. Why does it get labeled as being rich? And what does that really mean?
Yeah, when we use the term rich in relation to our foods, like I think that's really like a human food term. Like we say, oh, that dessert was rich, or dinner was really rich, right? Or whatever. I think we're typically referring to foods that were like higher in fat and sugar content. And so they're kind of indulgent, right? Rich foods we think of as being sort of indulgent. And I think that that's what's being applied to feeds like alfalfa when we use the term in our sort of in relation to what our horses are eating, but it doesn't actually have those same qualities that it would make it rich if it was a human food. But it is higher in protein, right? Alfalfa, as I mentioned, is higher in protein because of that ability to fix nitrogen, and it contains more calories per pound than an equal amount of grass hay would, and more calcium. So I think that's what we're tending to get at when we label alfalfa as being rich.
Can you give us some ballpark numbers?
Yeah, so alfalfa, when we're talking crude protein, is the alfalfa that we feed to horses, normally it's going to have sort of 15 to 22% crude protein. There's certainly alfalfa out there that's much higher in crude protein, like premium grade alfalfa. That's generally going to be fed to dairy cattle, and we don't want it to be. I mean, I've seen alfalfas with 24, 26% crude protein, and that's not what we want to be feeding our horses. So typically we're looking at sort of like 15, 22% crude protein in a horse alfalfa. And it has a better amino acid profile than grass hays do. And specifically has a little more lysine in it. And lysine is an essential amino acid that has to be in the diet. So I know I definitely have, for example, like dressage trainers who feel that if their horses don't get some alfalfa in the diet, they don't maintain their top lines as well. And there's probably some truth to that, right? Like they're by feeding a little bit of alfalfa in the diet, they are improving the amino acid profile of what the horse is eating and giving that horse more lysine. And lysine can be a limiting amino acid in the equine diet. So that's probably why they feel that they're seeing better muscling when they do feed some alfalfa. And then the calcium that's in alfalfa, especially alfalfa grown in the western states of the US, can have significantly higher calcium than grass hays would. And again, like alfalfa's grown in California, for example. When I was living there, it wouldn't be unusual to see an alfalfa that had 5, 6, 7 times more calcium than phosphorus, which is very different from grass hays, because grass hays grown in that same region might have a 1-to-1 calcium phosphorus ratio, sometimes even slightly less calcium than phosphorus, or just marginally more. So that's a big difference as well.
What are some legitimate benefits of feeding alfalfa?
Definitely that amino acid profile, right? And the protein, the higher protein content that can be helpful in helping to support muscle and tissue repair, overall body condition, those sorts of things. So, and it's doing a better job of providing those things than your typical grass hay would. So it's very helpful to horses that are, in harder work. And because it has more calories per pound, that's also true that it can be helpful for horses in harder work or harder keepers, because pound for pound is going to give them more calories per pound than a grass hay would. So it's an easy way to kind of sneak some extra calories into the diet without necessarily having to reach, for a grain per se. And to give some context of that, alfalfa is typically going to run around, 1 megacalorie per pound, maybe slightly more. I mean, really good alfalfa might be like 1.1 megacalorie per pound. The grass hays are going to be more, 0.8, 0.9 megacalories per pound. So it's not a very big difference, but if you have sort of a 6-7 pound flake, it starts to add up a little bit and can make a difference. So definitely it helps support those higher work levels and some of those harder performing horses. And then the higher calcium makes alfalfa a better stomach acid buffer than a grass hay. And so it's useful, in that context as well.
So this is why you see it fed to performance horses and young horses.
Exactly. Like growing horses have a really high requirement for crude protein, especially lysine. Lysine is really important for growth. Similarly, lactating mares and the horses in heavy work. And also seniors struggling to maintain muscle. A little bit of alfalfa in their ration can help that too.
Because alfalfa is thought of being rich, and rich human food tends to be high in sugar, I think that people are often surprised to learn that alfalfa is typically lower in sugar than grass hay.
Yeah, that's correct. So there's research been done and showing that it's a low glycemic index hay. And so compared to other forages, alfalfa is often lower in non-structural carbohydrates.
So do you recommend it for horses that are metabolic?
No, which is perhaps strange because you're just like, well, hang on a minute. She just said it's got low non-structural carbohydrate, but I actually don't, because I tend to find that the metabolic horses are easy keepers and need calorie restriction. And because the alfalfa hay is going to provide more calories per pound than the grass hay, it means I have to further restrict the amount of hay they're getting. And I always want to keep as much hay in front of the horses as possible. And, there is some very preliminary research showing that, feeding excess quantities of protein, some metabolic horses may be sensitive to that. And there's been a long-standing history of anecdotal evidence of people saying that their metabolic horses don't do well on alfalfa. I know other nutritionists that do feed alfalfa to metabolic horses, but it's not my personal preference.
You mentioned ulcers, and alfalfa often get recommended for horses with an ulcer history. Why is that? I know that I feed a little bit of alfalfa pellet, like before I put my horse in the trailer, or if, I'm showing up at a show, I'll give him some. He gets it on his regular ration, but I do give it extra times for that. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it really comes down to the protein the calcium. The higher calcium is a big one because we know that calcium is a buffer. Think about like if you take a Rolaids or Tums or something, right? That's calcium carbonate, often mixed with some magnesium, and it's known to buffer stomach acid. And because alfalfa has that higher calcium content, that's why it's, it does a really good job of buffering the stomach acid, and the protein helps with that to some extent as well. So yeah, it just does a better job of neutralizing stomach acid.
How much would you have to feed to potentially help with acid buffering?
Yeah, that was an interesting research study. I think it was done at in Texas. I think it was Texas A&M, somewhere in Texas. And they looked at feeding Bermuda hay versus feeding alfalfa. And they did show that there was better, buffering with the alfalfa than the Bermuda hay. And their sort of takeaway conclusion was that you really don't need very much, even as little as like a pound, might be helpful.
So feeding alfalfa before working is a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I would recommend feeding a small amount of alfalfa while you're grooming and tacking up before work. And, obviously long stem hay would be ideal because you get more chewing, and chewing causes saliva secretion, and equine saliva is kind of special in that it has a lot of sodium bicarbonate in it, which is an excellent stomach buffer. And so really, horses evolved, right? They were eating all the time. And because they were eating all the time, they secrete stomach acid all the time because they're they sort of evolved to expect food all the time. And so they're always getting that sodium bicarbonate going into their stomach. But, we manage them in ways where they're not always getting to chew all the time. And so you don't get that sodium bicarbonate in the saliva. So that's, again, another reason for feeding a little bit of alfalfa before you ride or go in the trailer, like you were saying. Not only do you get that buffering benefit of the alfalfa itself, but you also get that chewing and saliva production that's going to neutralize the stomach acid. And the benefit of feeding a long stem alfalfa in those situations is that the longer particle sizes, again, they also help with the acid splash, right? They sort of help kind of absorb all the acid and kind of hold it down in the bottom of the stomach so it doesn't splash around as much. And a lot of our ulcers, so the most common ulcers, are caused by sort of acid splash and acid coming into contact with that squamous mucosa that doesn't have any protection. And so not only are you helping to neutralize that acid so it's less corrosive, you're also helping to stop it splashing around so it doesn't come into contact with that sensitive tissue. And grass hay just won't neutralize acid as well as alfalfa, but it does have the same effect in that it does create a ball of, forage in the stomach the same way. And it does, stimulate chewing. So you do get the sodium bicarbonate. So while alfalfa would be, my preference in that situation, if you don't have access to alfalfa, and, grass hay to some extent will do the same thing. It just doesn't buffer as well.
And two things I want to say about that is that for our listeners, this is when you hear people talking about a mat, like making a mat in the stomach to stop the splash. Because a lot of times you see that referenced online that you feed the alfalfa to make the mat to protect that splash.
Right.
And then secondly, I feed alfalfa pellets, and that's mainly because I'm not going to buy a 100-pound bale of hay to feed a pound at a time. It's just crazy. Right. But, 1 pound of alfalfa pellets, it isn't that much. And if you do put that in your feed bucket and feed it to your horse, it's surprising how much saliva, even just from that little bit of chewing, actually takes place. You can really see it like in the feed tub just from feeding 1 pound of it. So, if you don't want to buy a bale like myself, certainly the pellets or the cubes. I don't feed cubes, but that would be another option, right?
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk about some of the myths, because there is a long list of them. The first one I think that everybody says is that alfalfa makes my horse hot. This one refuses to die.
That's so true. And there's no evidence that alfalfa increases excitability. Not scientific evidence. I think there's plenty of people who anecdotally believe that to be true.
We know that because they say it, at least once a day on Facebook. Somebody says it.
It must be true.
It must be true. So why do people say that? Or why do people actually see that their horses are getting hotter under saddle if they start feeding alfalfa?
Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons, right? That, it could be simply that the horse is getting more calories, right, than it has had in the past, and maybe more calories than it actually needs. And so it's got excess levels of calories. Maybe the horse just feels better nutritionally. Like if you've just been feeding grass hay and not a lot else, and then you suddenly start feeding a bit of alfalfa, you've improved that protein quality in the diet. You've got, as I mentioned, more of that lysine, like the horse's body is going to be able to function more optimally as a result of that, and they're just going to feel better. And when horses feel better, they sometimes behave in ways that we don't like, right? So, yeah, I mean, it can literally be as simple as that. And so, yes, I guess that means that the alfalfa is making their horse hotter, right? If you want it to be sort of,
not hotter,
like
feeling better,
right? And it's like, but it's not. It's not that the alfalfa made the horse hot. It's just like the horse feels better or the horse has more calories now. So you have to sort of take it. I think the problem with those statements is that you have to sort of look at, well, what was the horse being fed before it was given the alfalfa? And so, what was potentially missing that the alfalfa is now providing that's making that horse feel better or have too many calories such that its behavior is now different. And so therefore it doesn't mean that another horse is going to behave the same way if it's given alfalfa, right? Because its situation may be completely different.
That makes sense.
But it's easy to sort of take that label and like, oh my gosh, I fed alfalfa, my horse got totally hot. It's the alfalfa's fault. Well, yeah, it is the alfalfa's fault in inverted commas. But maybe it's just that the horse was nutritionally compromised before and it's less compromised now and it's just feeling better. And, is that the fault of the alfalfa? I guess. You could label it as a fault.
If that same horse was getting a balancer, which has a 30% protein in it, and then you started feeding them alfalfa, would you still get that same result? Or would you not if they were on a balancer and you added, like, do you understand what I'm saying?
Getting at? Yeah, like they're already meeting their amino acid profile, and so they're already in kind of a good place and what have you. And
right.
Yeah, maybe not. Again, right? It really comes down to the individual horse. And I think that's what I'm trying to say is like my problem is like when you make a blanket statement and label an entire like feed ingredient as like, oh, it'll make all horses hot. Well, that's not true. So it may make some horses hot in inverted commas, but it's not that alfalfa is a hot feed, right? There's something in that horse's situation that's making it be that way. But yeah, alfalfa on its own doesn't make horses hot.
Another myth I hear, especially with senior horses, is that alfalfa will cause kidney damage. Is that actually a concern?
Only in horses with pre-existing kidney disease. So if you have a horse that has, kidney issues, you don't want to be feeding high protein because obviously all the excess nitrogen that's in that protein has to be excreted as urea, and it's the kidney's job to kind of handle that, right, and make that happen. So if your kidneys are not functioning optimally, you want to lessen the load on them. But that's relatively uncommon and can happen in horses of any age, right? So when I've seen it, it's typically been the result of using medications incorrectly or like multiple medications at the same time and stressing, the kidneys out. However, as horses get older, they may become more prone to having kidney issues. And of course, our senior horses are often dealing with arthritis and low-grade pain. And often that's managed by putting them on ongoing NSAID medications, right? So the two sort of go hand in hand. I mean, I know horses in their 20s who have been on, NSAIDs, low level, a gram or whatever of an NSAID every day for
10 years.
Long. I was going to say quite that long, but years, right? And that's what makes them comfortable and kind of happy, able to get around in life and just be a little less creaky. And obviously that might be having an impact on the kidneys. And in that situation, you would want to limit your excess protein. That's not just alfalfa. Like you would want to check the whole diet and make sure you weren't going overboard with protein. And so it is typically recommended that if you're giving NSAIDs long-term, NSAIDs, I should say, it's non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, right? Your horse should be having its blood work checked at least annually, if not every 6 months, just to check kidney function to make sure everything is okay. Because it's possible that not only may they not be a good candidate for like alfalfa anymore, they also may not be a good candidate to stay on that medication anymore or to receive additional medication. So it's just, that's just part of management. If you're in that situation, you should be having the blood work done. But otherwise, healthy horses, there's no direct risk to the kidneys of feeding alfalfa.
What about the high calcium you mentioned earlier? Is that a concern Like it sometimes seems to come up and being thought to be the reason to not feed alfalfa.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, high calcium on its own is not harmful. Problems arise when the calcium to phosphorus ratio is poorly balanced over time. Right? That has an impact on bone health.
Which is manageable with proper diet formulation.
Exactly. And I will say that typically I want a diet. I'd rather go having way too much calcium and not enough phosphorus than the other way around, because the inverted, not having enough calcium and having too much phosphorus, that's much more detrimental to bone health, especially in the short term.
So is it the high calcium that people think is going to cause orthopedic issues in growing horses, like if they feed alfalfa?
Yes and no. I mean, certainly, a diet with very high calcium levels relative to phosphorus can be more of an issue in growing horses. Like we know in adult horses seem to handle up to 6 times more calcium than phosphorus in the diet just fine. Like there's research showing that doesn't really impact bone health. In young growing horses, it's a little different story. Like I'm much more motivated to try and get that calcium phosphorus ratio down to where it would ideally be, which ideally is like 1.5 to 2 times more calcium than phosphorus. When there's alfalfa in the diet, it's very difficult to get that below 2.5 times more calcium than phosphorus. So it's quite difficult to balance that ratio tightly when you have even just 1 flake of alfalfa in the diet. And I do care about that more when it's a young growing horse. But the myth that is really associated with growing horses and alfalfa is actually the protein. So there was some research done, I think it was back in the 1970s, and it was done in large breed dogs, actually, which you're a large breed dog lover. And so they did this research. I guess, large breed dogs also suffer from orthopedic issues in the, puppies and things. And so what they did was they fed high protein diets, and they saw more growth disorders in those puppies that were fed the high protein diets. And as a result, it was like, oh my gosh, don't feed young growing animals excessive protein. You're going to get all these, OCD and orthopedic type issues. What they didn't do, though, is they didn't control for the calorie intake. So as they increased the protein, the dogs also consumed more calories. And so subsequently, the work was redone. And the diets, the research diets were what we call isocaloric, meaning that the calories were maintained the same and only the protein increased. And when they did that, they could not recreate the orthopedic issues that had been seen. So they proved that, in fact, it wasn't the high protein that was causing the orthopedic issues. It was actually the excessive calorie intake. So sadly, this myth still exists, and it results in breeders not feeding their growing horses adequate protein. I mean,
it still exists in dogs. I mean, I have Great Danes. Yeah. Everybody knows that. I mean, it used to be a thing, and people still, truly believe that you shouldn't feed it. And right. Any vet you ask.
Yeah, it's getting better, but it's still there. Like it right. still won't go away. And I've had breeders tell me that their veterinarians have told them not to feed high protein, that it won't go away. And unfortunately, it results in, negative impacts on growth, because it's really important that you actually have adequate protein for growth, especially lysine. Lysine, like I mentioned earlier, that alfalfa has a slightly better, or more lysine in it than a grass hay. And lysine has been linked to, you can kind of stunt growth in horses by feeding adequate calories, but inadequate lysine. So it is a limiter of growth, and it's an important amino acid. So I've got no problem feeding some alfalfa to broodmares and growing foals if they need it for better protein quality and extra calories to maintain condition, especially those lactating mares, because it's really hard to get enough calories in those mares when they're lactating. So having some alfalfa can be really beneficial. Similarly, the same myth prevents folks from feeding high-protein ration balances. So when they're only feeding grass hay, so now you've got an easy keeper broodmare type, say ponies or like some of the Iberian breeds and what have you, which I find tend to be pretty easy keepers even when they're lactating. And they'll just be feeding a grass hay, and they don't want to feed a ration balancer because they're like, oh, it's 30% protein, and that's going to cause problems. And so it's just this lack of education and understanding, and this myth about protein and alfalfa and growing horses and OCD, just maybe one day it'll go away. I don't know.
Maybe. Let's talk about different ways people actually feed alfalfa, starting with long stem alfalfa.
Yeah, so this is the most common way that it gets fed and has the benefit of promoting more chewing and saliva production because obviously you've got these long particles of hay and the horse is going to have to chew them a lot more to get them down to a size where they can swallow them than say if you're feeding like a pellet or a cube like we were talking about earlier. So that's, that is a benefit. And obviously the more chewing you have, the more saliva production. So from that stomach buffering perspective, it's the long stem hay is, really helps with that.
But the quality can vary a lot.
Yeah, very much so. And I see that here. We grow. So I living in where I do in Arizona. This used to be the number one alfalfa growing area in the United States, I believe. Now it's all covered in houses, but there's still a fair bit of alfalfa grown here, and we can sort of oscillate between really nice green leafy alfalfa to, right now we're kind of getting to the end of last year's alfalfa. We won't start cutting alfalfa here probably, I think, until about April, maybe March if we have some really good weather. But it's like feeding sticks. It's really stemmy and completely different nutritional profile. So yeah, the quality can definitely vary.
Alfalfa is somewhat unusual in that it comes in cubes because you typically don't see any forages in the cube form except for alfalfa.
Yeah, that's true. And although I'm seeing more of them now, like traditionally, like grass hays just don't cube well. They don't maintain their cube form.
Their shape.
Yeah, their shape. And, and so they don't stay as cubes. And so you didn't see a lot of grass hay cubes, but I am seeing some. I'm seeing some Timothy cubes. I've seen some mixed grass hay, a little bit of alfalfa cubes. So we are starting to see more cubes. But yeah, the sort of the traditional hay that you would get in cube form is alfalfa. And, they're great for soaking. They're easy to measure. They are, potentially more consistent. Soaking's important if you've got a choke-prone horse, but I know lots of people that are feeding. I have barns here that feed cubes at least for one meal a day, and they're not soaking them. They just put them in a big wagon and come along with a shovel and just shovel them in and stick them in the feeders, and the horses just eat them. So they don't have to be soaked, but many people do soak them. And like I always say, like if you have the ability to soak something, it's always great to get water in your horse. So go ahead and soak them. But yeah, alfalfa definitely makes a nice cube.
We actually had a listener question about binders in cubes and pellets, for example, clays and aluminum silicates in feed. The listener said that they noticed that many feed companies use it in their feed as a binder, such as in alfalfa cubes or basically any pelleted feed, and that they read that it's good for gut health, but they aren't recommended for long-term use. These compounds may also bind to trace minerals in the horse's diet, which consequently would make them unavailable to the horse. So is it okay to feed hay pellets in cubes every day that contain clay and aluminum silicates?
Yeah, absolutely. That's not a concern for me, mainly because there's actually rules in the feed industry that you can't include them at more than 2%. So in reality, the amount your horse is consuming each day is tiny. And that's one of the reasons why that, rule is in there, that it can't be more than 2% of your pellet would be that binder. So I'm not concerned about that. And they are, again, there is research showing that they can actually be beneficial for gut health. So yeah, I don't worry about that.
Alfalfa pellets get mixed opinions. What do you think about those?
Yeah, they're certainly convenient. I think hay pellets in general, get mixed opinions, let's be honest, because people are, it's like, they don't take as long to eat. So if you're only feeding pellets, your horse isn't eating as long as they would be if long stem hay, to get less chew time and less saliva and less stomach buffering, and your horse is bored and, all those things. The reality is if your horse has terrible teeth and can't eat long stem hay, you may have no choice but to feed hay pellets. So again, it's always this case by case basis. If your horse has got no teeth and is choking all the time, feeding long stem hay is not good, right? So it's these blanket statements is where we get into trouble, right? It's the always never statements where we get into trouble. So pellets are certainly convenient and, can be, more consistent. And at least when you buy them in a bag, you at least get protein, fat, and fiber, which you don't get when you buy a bale of hay at your feed store, right? So you don't get a lot of information, but at least you get some. As I mentioned, they don't provide as much chewing time as a long stem forage, but a lot of people use a pound or two, like you said you do, to get a little extra protein into their horse, and also as a base for supplements and things that you need to feed, and they're perfectly reasonable for that use. I actually often recommend them where I have horses that don't need a full flake of alfalfa. So where I am, out in the West, well, we have like 110-pound bales of alfalfa. Most of our flakes are like 7-8 pounds. And so if you've got a smaller horse, that may be more alfalfa than you want to feed, but it's unrealistic to expect your boarding facility to feed a half a flake of alfalfa. Like I think you were mentioning that earlier, in your situation. Right. And it's much easier to say, okay, well, then I'll just buy a 50-pound bag of alfalfa pellets and I'll just put those pellets in the, whatever, like bag that I'm leaving my supplements in and just get them that way. And I'm measuring them so I know that they're getting exactly 2 pounds or exactly 3 pounds or what have you. So that's kind of how I think the pellets are really useful for that.
I think, like you said, when you wet them and you add supplements, medications, there's very few horses that turn their nose up to alfalfa pellets. They're pretty palatable.
Yeah, for sure.
Good way to hide things. Mm-hmm. Chopped alfalfa, that also exists. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. There is. There's several options for that on the market. Normally it comes in like bales, like a shavings bale. Kind of looks like that, plastic wrap shavings bale type thing. It's full of chopped alfalfa. And like I know in the UK, they have it too. Like I grew up feeding a chopped alfalfa over there. So it's available in many different locations where our listeners might be. I should mention that alfalfa in Europe and other places might be called lucerne. So if you're sitting here going, we don't have alfalfa. If you have lucerne, you have alfalfa, right? That's kind of what that is.
Good catch.
So, the chopped alfalfa is kind of that nice, sort of that happy medium, right? It's got a longer stem length than the pellet, so it's going to take more chew time. It's going to make a better, ball in the horse's stomach and absorb the acid and prevent acid splash better than pellets will. You don't have to worry about soaking it. I think it's kind of that happy medium, but and there's certainly multiple retailers in the US, and I know of some who are adding other additional ingredients that are beneficial for gut health to it as well, which again, specifically if you're dealing with horses with ulcer risk, that could be a nice addition. So there are some good options out there on the market.
What horses are a good fit for alfalfa? Who should be getting this?
Yeah, the performance horses, we talked about them earlier, right? The hard-working horses, it's a nice addition to them. Ulcer-prone horses, the hard keepers, some growing horses and broodmares can benefit, and some seniors will benefit as well. So those are the sort of the horses I most commonly think of potentially adding some alfalfa into their ration.
And who do we need to limit the alfalfa to? What horses shouldn't be getting this?
Probably those easy keepers and the overweight horses, right? That's the big one because it is the higher calorie content. And I guess if you had a situation where for some reason you needed to limit calcium, that would be a reason to avoid alfalfa as well.
I'm going to add something in here really quick that we didn't talk about, but because the country is frigid right now and there's a lot of people that have their horses inside the barn is closed up. What's the one thing they should be thinking about when they walk into that barn in the morning? What are they going to notice?
They'll really notice the ammonia smell. And actually that's, I was going to mention that as sort of my perhaps final recommendation.
Sorry.
But I know it's great because I've been sitting here thinking, I need to make sure I mention this at some point. So now you've helped me. I don't recommend feeding more than about 25-30% of the horse's total forage intake as alfalfa. So, we've talked about who I would give it to, performance horses, hard keepers, seniors, those kinds of things. But I'm only putting it in there as 25-30% of their total hay ration because otherwise it is just too much protein, too much calcium. And to your point, it can end up with a lot of ammonia production because the only way you can't store excess protein. So the only way to get rid of it is for them to break down the, protein into, urea and then, ends up in the atmosphere as ammonia. And that you kind of hit that sweet spot. And also, as I mentioned, it becomes very hard to balance if you put too much alfalfa in the diet, and it is a high calcium alfalfa. That it's very hard to get that calcium phosphorus ratio down close to 2-1 if you've got all alfalfa, for example. So again, there are exceptions. There are definitely horses I work with that they get straight alfalfa for whatever reason, but that's not the norm. My normal, my 99.9% of the horses I work with, if I'm putting alfalfa in their ration, it's only 25-30% of their total forage intake.
Most of these myths are not actually true. And it sounds like alfalfa can be a very useful tool depending on the horse.
Exactly. And just like many things, it's going to be great for some horses and a poor choice for others. So I think perhaps the takeaway from this episode is like, you can't make blanket statements about its suitability. It needs to be assessed on a horse by horse basis. It's going to be great for some, it's going to be unsuitable for others. And, if you can understand the facts about alfalfa and its nutrition profile and what it really brings to the table, you can make an informed decision of, when you might want to include it in your horse's diet and when it might be best to leave it out.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
We know that if you're like us, you're probably listening to this while driving or doing barn chores. But when your hands are free, if you'd share it with your friends on social media and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, it helps other horse lovers like you to find us.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.